Carl Jung's final message about empaths is not a comfort, it's an earthquake. What you've always believed to be your greatest virtue, your sensitivity, your compassion, may not be a spiritual gift at all. Jung discovered that extreme empathy often doesn't come from light, but from pain. It is not the call of the soul, but the scar of a childhood in which you were never allowed to fully exist. Think about it. The empath is not chosen to heal the world. In truth, they are the child who had to give up their own healthy selfishness in order to survive. The child who learned to erase themselves, to sense other people's moods before they could even understand their own feelings. That is not virtue, it is survival. But Jung went further. He saw that this sensitivity is neither a mistake nor a dead-end burden. It is simply half of the path toward what he called individuation, the psychological journey of becoming whole. And if you stay with me until the end of this journey, you'll understand why your empathy has always felt like both a gift and a curse, and you'll discover the secret Jung called sacred. Have you ever wondered why you feel so much? Why you sense tension in the air before anyone says a single word? Why it sometimes feels like you're carrying the invisible weight of everyone around you? Carl Jung believed this is neither coincidence nor a mystical gift. It is a hidden programming etched into your nervous system since childhood. Imagine a child growing up in an unstable environment. They learn far too early that their survival depends on their ability to decipher the moods of those around them. Before learning to read words, they learn to read facial expressions. Before understanding math, they already understand the tone of an irritated father's voice, the cold silence of a distant mother. That child becomes a walking emotional barometer. They know when a storm is about to break inside the house long before the first drop falls. Their skin tingles with premonitions no one else notices. Jung called this premature ego adaptation, when a child's sense of self forms too quickly, not out of maturity, but out of necessity. And this is the dark secret of empathy. It begins as emotional hypervigilance, an unconscious strategy for surviving a chaotic environment. The problem? The child's brain reorganizes itself. It becomes like a seismograph programmed to detect every tremor, every micro-expression, every shift in mood. This psychological radar, useful for avoiding conflict, hardens in adulthood into what we call empathy. But here is the central point that almost no one dares to say. The empath doesn't feel more because they are more enlightened. They feel more because they learned that feeling was the only way to stay safe.
And the cost of this adaptation is devastating. The child's own needs were erased. Healthy selfishness, the natural right to say no and exist for oneself, was sacrificed. Loving others became a matter of survival, and loving oneself became dangerous. In adulthood, this pattern continues. You become an expert at detecting other people's pain, but a stranger to yourself. You live other people's lives, but not your own. It's as if you developed a massive antenna to pick up every external emotion, while your own inner voice remains muted. Jung saw in this not only a tragedy, but also a sign of interrupted potential. He believed these individuals were halfway through the process of individuation, a process that requires recognizing the traumatic root of empathy and transforming it into a conscious choice. That's why your sensitivity is not a flaw. It is an extraordinary ability, but one born of fear. And the question is, will you continue living as a prisoner of this unconscious programming, or will you dare to transform your empathy from compulsion into power. If you've ever felt that you could read an entire room before understanding yourself, comment below, "I read emotions before words." That is the first step toward lifting the veil. There is a part of you that was never allowed to exist. I'm not talking about cruelty or deliberate malice, but something far simpler and far more dangerous to the child you once were: the right to put yourself first. Carl Jung called this the formation of the shadow through moral conditioning. Everything that was labeled wrong, selfish, or unacceptable in your childhood was pushed deep into the unconscious. Hidden there are your most human impulses: anger, the desire to say no, the need for rest, the wish to be respected, the simple act of having needs without apologizing for them. You were taught to believe all of this was dangerous, that expressing anger would destroy relationships, that setting boundaries would make people stop loving you, that putting yourself first was unforgivable selfishness. And so your shadow was shaped not by vices, but by the most authentic parts of who you are. Jung discovered something revolutionary. These impulses are not pathological. They are the missing pieces of a whole personality. The shadow is not a hidden monster. It is the secret vault of everything that could have given you strength, but that you learned to repress in order to be accepted. And here the paradox of the empath is born. The same sensitivity that makes you deeply connected to others also makes you deeply disconnected from yourself. The more you feel other people's pain, the further you drift from your own truth. That's why so many empaths carry a silent guilt. They feel wrong for wanting space, rest, or respect. This guilt doesn't come from the present. It comes from the old voice of a system that once punished any sign of a healthy ego. In the darkness of your shadow are not sins, but the keys to your liberation. And if you want to continue uncovering these hidden secrets of the psyche, don't let this be just another forgotten video. Subscribe to the channel now, because each new revelation could be the missing piece that allows you to become whole. The empath who never learned healthy selfishness inevitably becomes what Carl Jung called the wounded healer. Someone who gives, but not from wholeness, gives from emptiness. At first, this looks like virtue. You take pride in being the one who is always there, the constant shoulder, the anchor that never fails. But behind this role lies a silent cost: resentment. For every yes you give to others, there is a hidden no to yourself. With every sleepless night, every burden you carry, a part of you is sacrificed in the name of other people's peace. Jung described this phenomenon through the principle of compensation. Everything that is exaggerated eventually turns into its opposite. What begins as endless compassion soon or later becomes bitterness. What appears to be limitless generosity collapses into outbursts of anger. That's why so many empaths report moments when they suddenly lose control, as if all the accumulated patience shatters in a matter of seconds. Because, as Jung observed, those who never say no eventually explode. This is the cruel paradox. The more you try to be indispensable, the more you lose yourself. And the more you ignore your own needs, the louder your body and psyche begin to scream in silence through exhaustion, irritability, and psychosomatic illness. The wounded healer is not an enlightened altruist. It is someone who, without realizing it, learned to bleed in order to keep others standing. And this is the point where life demands a choice: to continue being a martyr to your own emptiness, or to learn how to integrate what you were always told was selfishness. There comes an inevitable moment in the empath's journey when the entire system collapses. You wake up one day and realize you can no longer care with the same intensity. What once fueled you, listening, helping, saving, now feels like chains. Other people's problems, which once gave you purpose, now drain your soul. You begin to wonder, is something wrong with me? Have I lost my heart?
Carl Jung called this moment the crisis of individuation. It is not failure. It is not weakness. It is the psyche demanding that you become who you truly are, and not merely the character you learned to play in order to survive. This crisis often arrives disguised as exhaustion, anxiety, even depression. But in Jung's view, it is a spiritual emergency. The soul rebels against continuous self-abandonment. The false self, the one shaped by compulsive service to others, begins to collapse. Here, a fundamental concept emerges: the transcendent function. Jung believed the psyche has the capacity to unite opposites, in this case, the compulsive caregiver and the authentic being who longs for space, boundaries, and sovereignty. This is not about choosing between empathy and selfishness. It is about integrating both poles into something greater: wholeness. And like all transformation, this process unsettles the world around you. People close to you may say, "You've changed. You're not the same person anymore. You've become selfish." But Jung warned, this resistance is not proof of error, it is proof of growth. Those who truly love you will support your individuation. Those who resist were merely benefiting from your self-abandonment. The crisis of individuation is not the end of empathy. It is the birth of a new form of care, conscious, selective, and rooted in your own inner wholeness. If someone has ever accused you of changing when you began to set boundaries, comment now: "I didn't change. I just stopped hiding." That is the mark of one who has crossed the crisis and taken the first step toward inner freedom. Carl Jung understood something most people reject. Without a solid core of ego, there is no true compassion. What we call limitless altruism is not virtue, it is a prison. That is why Jung spoke of something we can call sacred selfishness. This is not destructive narcissism, but the psychological right to fully exist, to care for yourself with the same intensity with which you have always cared for others. This sacred selfishness rests on three fundamental pillars. 1. Emotional sovereignty. You are not responsible for other people's feelings. Since childhood, you believed you had to keep everyone calm, happy, and stable in order to feel safe. But that burden was never yours. Jung warned that taking on another's pain prevents their growth and at the same time drains your vital energy. Freedom begins when you return to each person the responsibility for their own emotions. Awareness of boundaries.
An unconscious empath does not know where they end and where the other begins. They absorb, merge, and erase themselves. The integrated empath, by contrast, learns to recognize the contours of their own soul. Jung called this ego development, the construction of boundaries that make authentic relationships possible, where two individuals meet as equals. The legitimacy of needs. In childhood, you were taught that your desires were dangerous. Now you must reclaim a forgotten truth. Your needs are just as valid as anyone else's. Rest, recognition, reciprocity, respect. These are not luxuries, they are foundations. Jung observed that a healthy individual is able to love others to the same degree that they love themselves. When these three pillars take root, empathy ceases to be compulsion and becomes choice. You no longer give because you have to, but because you want to. You no longer offer from a painful emptiness, but from an abundance that overflows. This is the path toward what Jung called differentiated love, caring without self-erasure, supporting without dissolving, feeling without disappearing. If this message resonates with you, write in the comments, "I give from what overflows, not from emptiness." This is the mantra of those who reclaim their sacred selfishness. When you begin to practice sacred selfishness, something inevitable happens. Your relationships change, and that change is not always gentle. Carl Jung observed that many empaths lived in relationships based on what he called projective identification. This means that the people around you were not relating to you as an individual, but as a function. You were the caregiver, the listener, the problem solver. They did not see your wholeness, only the role that was useful to them. When you begin to say no, when you set boundaries, when you choose to put yourself first, something unsettling happens. These people feel as if a vital resource has been taken away from them. This is what I call the withdrawal of emotional supply. Unlimited access to your time and energy disappears, and then come anger, manipulation, and accusations. How many times have you heard phrases like, "You're not the same person anymore," "You've become cold," "You've turned selfish"? In truth, what changed was not you, it was the power dynamic. What was once sustained by your self-abandonment now demands reciprocity, and not everyone is willing to offer that. But Jung also revealed something extraordinary. The relationships that survive this transition become deeper, more authentic, and more transformative. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." When you practice sacred selfishness, you discover who is truly by your side out of love and who was merely benefiting from your silence. This is relational recalibration. Some bonds dissolve, others are reborn with unprecedented strength. And in the midst of this process, a brutal yet liberating truth emerges. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your empathy. If you've noticed that setting boundaries pushed some people away but drew in others who are more genuine, write in the comments, "I attracted my equals when I stopped accepting less." This is the secret code of recalibration, losing what was never authentic in order to gain what was always real. What happens when the empath crosses the crisis, faces their shadow, and reclaims sacred selfishness? A new identity emerges, the integrated empath. They are no longer held hostage by the compulsion to feel everything all the time. They possess what Jung described as empathic consciousness, the ability to decide when, how, and even how much to feel with others. Sensitivity, once a prison, now becomes a tool. The integrated empath develops three essential abilities. 1. Emotional choice. Empathy is no longer automatic. They can switch on or switch off this antenna, choosing when to enter another's pain and when to preserve their own energy. 2. Compassionate detachment. They care without carrying. They love without dissolving. They offer support without assuming responsibilities that are not their own. Jung described this as loving distance, close enough to help, distant enough to maintain clarity. And 3. Reciprocal relationships. The integrated empath no longer engages in one-sided exploitative dynamics. They attract people who also know how to give, and in this meeting arises what Jung called mutual individuation. Both grow side by side as equals. This transformation creates an inner stability that Jung called earned security. External applause or approval is no longer needed to feel at peace. The source of strength is now internal. As Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." The integrated empath finally awakens, not to the world of others, but to their own wholeness. The most unsettling revelation Carl Jung made about empaths is also the most liberating. Your empathy was never at its core about others. It was always about you, about a desperate effort to stay safe in an unpredictable world. In childhood, you learned that if you could keep everyone calm, anticipate their needs, erase yourself so as not to provoke conflict, you might be able to avoid chaos. This unconscious programming later became what adults called your gift. But the truth is, your empathy was born of fear. And here comes the decisive moment. When you see this truth clearly, two doors open. The first is prison, remaining trapped in the same pattern, repeating the compulsion to feel for everyone else in order to avoid feeling your own emptiness. The second is freedom, recognizing that what was once survival can now become a conscious choice. Jung believed this moment was the true turning point of individuation, when you become the author of your own psychological story. Empathy ceases to be compulsion and becomes a tool. You don't feel because you have to, you feel because you choose to. But this awakening does not come without pain. It brings what Jung called existential guilt. It is the feeling of betraying yourself and others. The inner voice whispers, "But I've always been the helper. People depend on me. What if no one loves me anymore when I stop being useful?" This guilt is in fact the final resistance of the false self, the identity built around compulsive service. And like every symbolic death, it demands mourning. Jung spoke of mourning the identity, the painful process of saying goodbye to a version of yourself that was never real, yet felt so familiar. And here the paradox of freedom emerges. When help ceases to be compulsive and becomes voluntary, it does not lose its value. On the contrary, it becomes more powerful, more authentic, because it is given from a place of abundance, not necessity. The final realization is this: you were never meant to be the emotional guardian of the world. You were meant to be a conscious individual, capable of choosing when and how to offer your gifts. In freedom, your empathy stops being a wound and finally becomes a superpower. The empath who awakens to their freedom discovers something even deeper.
the need for what Jung called psychological sovereignty. It means recognizing that you are the ultimate authority over your own inner experience. No one else gets to dictate what you should feel, how much you should give, or who you should be. But reaching this sovereignty requires two painful movements. The first is what psychologists call reparenting, becoming the parent you never had. This does not mean romanticizing a lost childhood, but offering yourself what was denied to you: unconditional acceptance, gentleness, care. It is learning to speak to yourself with the same compassion you always reserved for others. It is giving yourself rest without guilt. And here the paradox of freedom emerges. When help ceases to be compulsive and becomes voluntary, it does not lose its value. On the contrary, it becomes more powerful, more authentic, because it is given from a place of abundance, not necessity. The final realization is this: you were never meant to be the emotional guardian of the world. You were meant to be a conscious individual capable of choosing when and how to offer your gifts. In freedom, your empathy stops being a wound and finally becomes a superpower. The empath who awakens to their freedom discovers something even deeper: the need for what Jung called psychological sovereignty. It means recognizing that you are the ultimate authority over your own inner experience. No one else gets to dictate what you should feel, how much you should give, or who you should be. But reaching this sovereignty requires two painful movements. The first is what psychologists call reparenting, becoming the parent you never had. This does not mean romanticizing a lost childhood, but offering yourself what was denied to you: unconditional acceptance, gentleness, care. It is learning to speak to yourself with the same compassion you always reserved for others. It is giving yourself rest without guilt, validating your desires without shame, celebrating your victories without waiting for external applause. The second movement is facing the grief of the unlived life, recognizing that you sacrificed dreams, passions, choices, and even authentic relationships to keep others comfortable. This grief is devastating because it forces you to confront the sum of everything that could have been. But Jung saw this process as essential. Only by honoring what was lost does the psyche create space for what can still be born. And the result of this passage is surprising. When you learn to nourish yourself, your compassion does not diminish, it multiplies. It is no longer a compassion that bleeds until it is empty, but one that overflows from wholeness. Jung called this state liberated love. Help that does not create dependence, presence that does not demand reciprocity, affection that does not bind, it simply flows. This is the true power of psychological sovereignty, no longer depending on external chaos to define your inner peace. You become a source. You become a root. You become whole. And only those who nourish themselves can truly nourish others. But there is a subtle danger Carl Jung called the temptation of regression. After you've claimed your freedom, after you've built boundaries and begun to live authentically, you will be tested. The world around you, accustomed to your submissive version, will try to pull you back. It happens in almost imperceptible ways: disapproving looks, comments that imply coldness, accusations of selfishness. They are like invisible chains trying to drag you back into the role of the compulsive caregiver. Jung understood this as collective resistance to individual growth. The group, the family, the friends, all were shaped by the old version of you. When you change, they feel threatened, and the pressure is immense. Return to what is familiar so not to disappoint, not to lose connections, not to be labeled too hard or too cold. But here is the truth. Real growth requires enduring the discomfort of being misunderstood. You do not need to regress to soothe others. If you do, you will be betraying not only yourself, but the very purpose of your individuation. As Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Do not allow the temptation of regression to erase this achievement. If you have ever felt this pressure to return to your old role, declare in the comments, "I choose when to care, and that makes me stronger." This is the silent vow of those who remain steady in their transformation. Jung's final truth about empaths is clear. You were never too sensitive for this world. You were simply incomplete. Your journey is not about becoming less empathic, but about becoming consciously empathic. No longer someone who gives until they disappear, but someone who chooses when, how, and how much to give, and precisely because of that, offers care that is purer, more authentic, more transformative. The child who was never allowed to be selfish now matures into the adult who recognizes their right to fully exist. This is true sacred selfishness, loving yourself with the same intensity with which you have always loved others. If this message resonated with you, leave a comment below. I am enough for myself. This statement is a seal, a pact with yourself and with your individuation. And if this video brought clarity to your journey, leave a like as well. It's not just a gesture of support for the channel, but a symbol of your decision to keep awakening. And don't stop here. Continue diving into the other videos on the channel, because each one is a key to illuminating parts of your own shadow. See you in the shadows of the next hidden truth.